The next section is entitled The Center and its Urge to Demobilize. Nimzowitsch writes, examples of this, i.e. the center and its urge to demobilize, are when and how to resist the advance of your opponent's center, and on maintaining and giving up the center, and in which situations it's right to maintain the center and which situations it's right to give it up. As has already been mentioned, a free and mobile center constitutes a terrible attacking weapon, since the threatened advance of the central pawns would drive back the opponent's pieces. However, in all such cases it depends on whether the knight which is driven off is in fact driven from so-called pillar to post, or whether it will manage to find a good position or make good use of its tempi, its move. So we can have a look at an example. Let's say e4, e5, d4, e takes d4, and this move immediately makes white's e-pawn mobile, which is the point of what Nimzowitsch is talking about. And so, for example, if there's a knight here on f6, he can play e5 and knock the knight around. And so say white continues with c3. He's playing the Danish Gambit here. It's sharp but unsound Gambit. And let's say, for the sake of illustration, that black answers with knight f6, taking a chance which Nimzowitsch felt every beginner should do in order to experience what the consequences of the central advance will be. Namely, after e5, knight e4 is the correct move, because the knight can hang on here. If instead knight d5, then queen takes d4 is it's getting another tempo on the knight, and not, it should be pointed out, bishop c4 attacking the knight, or the apparent gain of tempo is lost after knight b6 and the bishop is attacked. So queen takes d4, and now c6 to defend the knight. Bishop c4 is now good, knight b6, and now knight f3. And in this position, white effectively has 6 tempi compared to 2 or even 1.5 for black, because the knight is no better positioned on b6 than it was on f6, and this move c6 is hardly worth a full tempo, since it's not a move by a central pawn, i.e. it hasn't contributed to black's development. So e4 is the right square for the knight. And say, for example, if white tries bishop d3 to gain the tempo, now comes d5, which is a valid developing move, and it also defends the knight. And this is a correct move. If instead c5, knight c5, then c takes d4, and if knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and white is 4 tempi ahead with no compensation for black. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. The next example is from a King's Gambit. So e4, e5, now f4, e takes f4, knight f3, knight f6 is one variation of King's Gambit. It's fairly rare to see it, but it's good for the purposes of explaining what Nimzowitsch is talking about. So e5, and in this position black is faced with a problem, because going to e4 now will lose a couple of tempi. Let's see, if he goes to e4 and then d3, knight c5, d4, and so on, like we saw earlier. So better instead is knight h5. It's breaking one of the traditional chess axioms that a knight on the rim is dim. In this instance, it is, in the words of Nimzowitsch, an appropriate square given the position. And play might continue d4, and this knight here on h5 is protecting the f4 pawn, which is, you know, why it's useful where it is. And black can play d5 now, and from here he's doing just fine, although white does have some compensation for the pawn. And black doesn't even have to play d5 here, he can play d6 as the other move that Nimzowitsch gave, which he says is playable because it forces the exchange of the white e-pawn, which has moved twice, for the black d-pawn here, which has only moved once. So, you know, it's the same idea in mind, i.e. gain of tempo. Okay, so now we'll have another look at a position that we've already glanced at briefly and explored a little further. So we go e4, e5, d4, center game again, e takes d4, c3, and now this move, knight f6. So let's say e5, and now knight d4, as we saw is the right move. So bishop d3 and d5. If e takes d6, and of course knight takes d6, and black is doing well there. So let's say white plays c takes d4 instead. Nimzowitsch writes, black need not imagine himself to be in safety, since in the air there's a tempo-winning attack on the knight at e4 here with knight c3. But black can develop an attack at the same time, for example with knight c6 here, and you know, attacking d4, and if knight f3, then bishop g4, again threatening d4, taking away the defender. And there's no threat of taking here, because after e takes d4 the queen will be protecting the knight on d4 if it takes there. And another way that black can attack is by playing c5 at the right moment. But Nimzowitsch is quick to point out that playing bishop b4 with check, although it looks tempting instead, would be wrong, because white can just answer bishop d2, and then black is forced into a tempo losing exchange. So so that's no good. So let's say knight c6. Yeah, well, what I just mentioned as bishop b4, then bishop d2, and black's going into a tempo losing exchange. So we can just see that variation I was talking about. Knight c6, now knight f3, so knight c6 attacks d4, knight f3 defends it, and now bishop g4 planning to take away the defender. And you know, black has active and easy play right out of the opening here, which is a clear sign that white has gone wrong somewhere. And you know, according to Nimzowitsch, in any case it's more prudent to keep the center intact, and from black's point of view this is, and even if we manage to hold up the advance of the pawn mass as it ground forward, so-called pawn roller, by the correct moves of the knight here on e4, which, you know, have been demonstrated here, such a method of play, he says, is difficult, and moreover the pawn roller does not need to move forward at once, but its possible advance constitutes a permanent threat to hang over our head. And he sums up this section by saying, so as long as it is possible without any other disadvantage, hang on to the center. And you know, he makes some really good points here, notably that this method of dealing with a central advance by aiming to move the knight, you know, if e5 is played, then knight d4, sometimes knight d5 is playable. You know, like having your way of dealing with that by moving the knight to a good square is not always easy, and it's, you know, requires accuracy, and kind of you have to take a risk sometimes if you want to play that way. And so if you're not comfortable with that, it might be better to look for alternatives if possible. And as well as that, the second point he made, that your opponent doesn't have to advance his central pawns immediately, is also very valid. There's often a lot to be gained in delaying a central advance, such as the ones we've seen here, because it makes the defensive task a lot more complicated for your opponent if the position hasn't been solidified. If your pieces and pawns remain fluid, he's got a lot more to figure out. There's a lot more possibilities for attack and so on. So it's a good thing to remember if you're the one with the mobile pawn center as well. Okay, so the next section, and this will be the last example for this section. We'll go again with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, the Italian game, and now bishop e7 from black, which is the Hungarian variation, which is less aggressive than bishop c5, but it's playable, but a bit passive. So white plays d4 to attack immediately the black center. And now if you want to try and find the best move for black in accordance with what we've been looking at, please stop the video now. d6 is the move, as it keeps intact and thus protects the black center. In particular, a pawn will be maintained here at e5, and it restrains and keeps immobile the white center. These pawns, they're not going anywhere, so that's the aim of this move. And after d takes e5, d takes e5, the center remains restrained. This e pawn is obviously blocked by black's e pawn. It's not going anywhere, so black has done well here. And it's also valid to point out that black could have bolstered with f6 instead of d6, but of course that has obvious drawbacks given the bishop striking down in this diagonal. Black couldn't castle kingside, at least not straight away, so it's obviously better to play d6. And Nimzowitsch makes an interesting point here, that pawns are born defenders, and it's definitely true that a pawn feels at home doing a defensive job, like the pawn on d6 was a moment ago, defending the pawn on e5. And a pawn feels right in the defensive role like that, whereas if a piece is assigned a defensive role to support a pawn or another piece, generally it feels restricted as a result, and like it's not unleashing its full potential. And we can have a look at that idea in this example. If instead of d6 at this stage, black had defended this pawn with a piece, let's say with bishop f6, white is just clearly better. After d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, and well, there's a couple of good moves here for white. He can play f4, so winning a tempo immediately, or if he likes, he can win a pawn with bishop takes f7, king takes f7, and queen d5 check is gonna win that loose bishop here. So either of those is much better. So we can see why it's, in this instance anyway, and almost always it was better to defend with a pawn in the center than it is with a piece. Okay, so we go to the last section for this one, and this last section is called surrendering the center, and this time Nimzowitsch looks at the Scotch opening with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, and e takes d4 is the main line. In this instance, playing instead d6 is not good, because white can just trade and then trade queens unfavorably for black because he loses castling rights for little compensation, and white has the initiative after bishop c4, attacking f7. So e takes d4 is correct. And after knight takes d4, black can, in accordance with what we have been looking at, play knight f6, because he can deal with the e5 advance in a satisfactory manner thanks to this knight here on c6. It can't be played straight away anyway. So white would first of all exchange if you wanted to advance. So it's knight takes c6, b takes c6 to avoid the queen trade. Now e5, and knight e4, and bishop d3. It's white's trying to develop with tempo, but again here black can answer with d5. And something that's important to note in this particular example is that black has only solved half of his problems here, i.e. the development of this knight, which was going to be tricky with this mobile e-pawn. His other problem, which is bigger, lays in the center itself. Black could have solved that instead of solving the problem of his knight, but he wouldn't have played this line. Instead, black would have done the following. In the words of Nimzowitsch: if you have allowed your opponent to establish a free and mobile center pawn, then that pawn must be considered to be a dangerous criminal, a runaway. All your chess fury must be directed against it. This leads by force to the following condition: the pawn must either be executed by d7 to d5, and then d takes e4 must be prepared for, or imprisoned. So we either condemn the criminal to death or to a life sentence in prison, or else there is a neat combination of both, 15 years in prison and a death sentence, as it were, by which we first sentence it to death and then commute that sentence to lifelong imprisonment. Or, what is more usual, we restrain the e4 pawn until it is quite crippled backward, and then we show what we are made of and carry out the sentence of death by playing d7 to d5 and then d takes e4. And once the mobile pawn has been dealt with, then the disturber of the piece is gone, and we can develop easily without having to worry about these complications and everything else. And for example, in this position, if we wanted to play that way instead of just worrying about how to develop this knight, we would have played differently from about move 4. Instead of playing knight f6 after knight takes d4 here, instead of knight f6 here, we will play d6. So we're restraining the pawn from moving, and we would follow up with knight f6, bishop e7, castling, then playing rook e8 and bishop f8, which is going to absolutely ensure that there can be no advance. White, at the same time, will try and make his e-pawn mobile in order to give black some headaches, to try and play e5 and knock back the knight and get some kind of attack. He can try and do this by playing f4 at the right moment, followed up with the rook e1 after he's castled to support the advance. From this position, the game might continue as follows: bishop e2, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, castles, castles, f4, rook e8, and if black tries d5, white will simply answer with e5, and he's achieved what he wanted. So let's say bishop e3, bishop f8, and now we can see that black, with the pawn at the d6, knight at c6, rook at e8, has control of e5, so he's restraining this advance. And the e4 pawn here is weak. It's become backward because f4 has been played in an attempt to play e5. So play might continue bishop f3 and bishop d7, and the development and mobilization can now be considered complete for both sides. And the main positional struggle here remains for white to play e5 and black aiming to prevent it. And such positions give rise to very interesting struggles, and I encourage everyone to try similar approaches with both colors. And I'm aware, of course, that the ideas in this first chapter will seem relatively simple to many of you, but it does no harm to remind ourselves of such things, and when we get to the later, more complex chapters, we'll be referring back to these early ones, so it's a necessary step. Nimzowitsch closes the chapter with a few paragraphs on the dangers of pawn grabbing in the opening, which I feel we do not need to discuss too much, as it is obviously not a good idea. The one exception he points out is that if it's a central pawn that is won in the process, and he is very specific in stressing that this is done not for the gain of material, but for the gain of the center itself, the positional gain, which, if it comes at the price of a tempo and we can get away with it, it's almost definitely worth it, if you can get away with it. And if a pawn is being snapped up, it's a worthy price, just a tempo, for a better center, and just as long as there's not too much compensation for your opponent. However, he's very quick to point out, if the pawn to be snapped up is on the flanks, Nimzowitsch expressly condemns it. So it would be brilliant to see his reaction to Fischer's employment of the poison pawn Neudorf with black, where black snaps up this pawn on b2. It would have been brilliant to see those two play. Unfortunately, it never happened. Okay, so that's the end of the first installment and the first chapter of the elements from Nimzowicz's My System. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.